and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. 2 points that come out of this text. First of all, dying in faith. Sorry, dying in faith and living in faith. First of all, dying in faith. Well, obviously here people are being commended for the way that they died, which implies there are bad ways to die. And you could easily here spend a lot of time in ways that people die that are not good. People die in regret. People die in fear. People die in despair. People die in denial of what's happening to them. People die in sin. People die in self-sufficiency. And so on. Many bad ways to die. But here, the good way to die, the only good way to die is held in front of us, and that is dying in faith. And of course, that's really what these chapters are all about, especially this one, about who our faith is in, how that faith is exercised, how it is demonstrated and proven and attested. The focus in these immediate verses is Abraham, the father of the faithful. And really what's emphasized here is the triumph of such a death. These all died in faith. It's not a lament. It's a real note of triumph. And of course, we'd all like to die like that. We'd all like it to be said of us, he died in faith. But there's only one way to that, and that's to live in faith. If you want to die in faith, you have to live by faith. And that's the wider context of these verses. And here we have, first of all, the visible promises that this faith was in. It says they did not receive the promises, but having seen them afar off. So here we're told they saw promises, but didn't receive the things promised. They saw them afar off at a distance of time. They saw enough to be saved, but they longed to see more. So they saw the promises. Secondly, these were persuasive promises. It says, and were persuaded of them. And that suggests a struggle, doesn't it? A battle. Some resistance to this faith. It wasn't so easy as just these few words might make out it to be. And then these were welcome promises. It says they were persuaded of them and embraced them. So this isn't just some kind of cold, formal assent to promises. This is warm, hearty, welcoming. As one of the Puritans said, faith has long arms. These arms were so long they reached way down the road of history to embrace the one promised. And then lastly, these are transforming promises. The result of this, they saw, they persuaded, they embraced, they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. And we see here a transformation of this earth into a foreign land. By embracing these promises, it transformed this world into a world that they felt ill at ease in, not at home, strangers, aliens, pilgrims. But it also transformed heaven into the fatherland, their homeland. They that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. So they have a country, they had a home, but it wasn't here. Fatherland, homeland was ahead. few more verses on that you can read, but it all ends with, wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God. And it literally means not to blush. And positively, really, it means he glories in them. He delights in such people. Pray then. O Lord, when it comes for us to die, we pray that we would all die in faith, having lived also by faith. And use us, we pray, in the lives of others so that they too live in and by faith, so that they too can die in faith. We remember here today wonderful Christians we have known, whose deathbeds we have stood beside and sat beside and sucked the sweetness out of these verses there, knowing that they died in faith which transforms everything. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're going to look today at counselling the grieving, especially those who have been bereaved. And there are multiple aims in such counselling. First of all, to sustain through the grief. Secondly, to turn grief to a good purpose. Thirdly, to glorify God in the grief. And then lastly, ultimately, remove or at least reduce the grief. Beginning with love. Obviously, death is the universal human experience, the most painful of all human experiences. And if there's a time when people need love, it's the time when they have lost a loved one. And so, in such circumstances, we want to practice fast or speedy love. We want to go to the bereaved as soon as we possibly can, making it a priority despite all our inconveniences. Now, you might recall a lecture in leadership class, some of you who take that, where we talked about the well-planned life rather than a reactionary life. It's very tempting for those of us who want to live that 100% well-planned life, that we view these things as interruptions, as inconveniences. But this is the time to just get rid of all these well-planned lives and just react as fast as you possibly can. It's better to annoy people by getting there too fast than to do so by being too slow. You can get there too fast. Obviously, families want to grieve as well on their own without any intrusion at times, and you have to gauge that. But don't be slow to get beside people. Secondly, bodily love. So here you've got mourners. What are they feeling? They're feeling the loss of love, but they're feeling, above all, they're feeling the loss of a body, of an embodied person, of someone really special to them. And the physical absence, the absence of the person's body, is sometimes just an overwhelming experience, especially when, say, the body is removed from the hospital bed or from the home. And so this is time to be very physical with people, to give them a hug, to hold them, to touch, to hold their hands, to make them feel warm life in the midst of such cold death and absent body. And this is true, it really, in these circumstances, all our carefulness and caution about physical contact with females, really, it doesn't matter at that point. Everybody wants a hug, and in such circumstances, it's not going to be misconstrued, as long, of course, you don't labor it and linger over it and so on, and you don't do it too often. I think the first time you walk into a home, just give everyone a hug, but You don't want to do that the 4 or 5 times that you go in over the next few days or weeks. Tearful love, number 3. We want to weep with those that weep. I think this is one of the greatest things you can pray for, that God give you the ability to weep. Now, it's not an absolute necessity that you weep in order to communicate your own sorrow and sympathy, but wow, what an asset this can be. Nothing communicates really like real, genuine tears. Now, of course, you don't all either want to become the focus, and you end up getting comforted by the bereaved. And I know a minister like that. He can turn on the tears, and he does it in almost every sermon as well. And but again, for men, if they see you weeping genuine tears, it can often be a tremendous relief valve for them too. It sort of gives them permission and encouragement to also cry and weep. Number 4, quiet love. As I said before, don't be afraid in these circumstances to be speechless. It's better that than trying to fill every moment with just empty, superficial words. And really, it's very easy in these circumstances when you maybe embarrassed by silence, you're trying to fill it up, that you end up saying something really stupid. And better say nothing than that. I remember going into a home once where a man had died of cancer, and he was married to a lovely, godly woman. And it was the first time really I'd experienced it. I just literally couldn't say anything. It must have been about 5 minutes. And we all sat there, her 2 daughters and her son, and it was just very comfortable. There was no sense of, is a minister going to speak, And I had no sense of urgency about it either. So it's not to go in with a plan, but just have a sensitivity and be natural and just pray for that wisdom to know the best ways to act and react in these circumstances. But quiet is good. Patient love. This is going to take a long time for people to get through. There are some people who can move through grief very quickly. They're very rare, though. For a lot of people, the vast majority, it's many, many months, maybe even some years in some cases. And of course, in every case, you never really get over it in the sense that you completely forget it and it never impacts you. People have lost loved ones, a wife, a husband, a son, a daughter, brother, sister. There's hardly a day goes by. You don't think about it at least once. It's not overwhelming and debilitating, of course, but it's always there. And I just say that because don't think, okay, 6 months down the line, even 2 years down the line, I don't need to think about that in this person's life anymore. Just always be wary of it being an issue ongoing, and ask the question, do it ever still trouble you? Does it ever really get you down? So you want to be patient with people. Don't rush them through on the whole, although we'll get to that in a minute. Truthful love. You have the message of life in the midst of death. You have a message of comfort in the midst of sorrow. And to bring the truth. Well, aren't you thankful you're a Christian pastor in these circumstances? Especially when you begin to see how non-Christians act and speak in bereavements, whether you're in hospitals or homes, and you see how utterly foolish or empty their words and actions are. To know that you don't have to think something up. It's been thought up for you already, and you just need to bring it. And then genuine love. Try not to become a professional mourner. By that I mean sometimes a pastor can get so used to death that he no longer feels it. And mourners can detect that. It's very easy to fall into that if you end up in a large congregation. You may be doing a funeral every other week. But just pray that God would keep you from just being a professional in these circumstances. Or, again, another difficulty can be you can, as a pastor, be coming from a place of great joy, like, say, the birth of a child. And then on the way home, you have to visit a grieving family, and there's a kind of emotional whiplash there. And you can, it's very easy to come from a situation of great joy, and you're still kind of beaming in a way. You still have that, joy coursing through your veins. And you go into this situation, and you really do feel the difficulty of adjustment, and sometimes you don't adjust, and it jars with people. So take your time, go somewhere else, compose yourself, so that you really do communicate. You're genuinely involved with this family and situation. Just again, rely on heaven's help. Don't think, well, I've done this 20 times, 30 times, 50. I can do this. I know all that will be said. And no, just don't rely on your experience. Rely upon God. Yeah.
Couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, on the fast, love, what sort of time is appropriate? Once you've heard that, say, a member of the congregation has passed away, you've probably heard from the family. If they don't say a time, which they probably won't, because they're
Right.
other things on their mind.
Yeah.
How long should you leave it?
Yeah, you just ask.
Okay.
I'd love to come and see you today, but I know there'll be so much going on. What's the best time for you?
Ideally the same day?
I would say so, yeah. I wouldn't, unless they're really, really, genuinely putting you off. Some people say, oh, don't rush, Pastor, but they really mean get down here as fast as you can. But, say if it's late at night and there's a lot going on, they might genuinely mean that, and they really don't want you, but in most cases you really want to get there before the night passes, yeah.
The other one was on the bodily love. Americans are a lot better at this.
Yes, they are.
But I'm thinking of a lot of people I know back home, particularly, but not so much the problem with a man and a woman, but just men and men.
Yeah.
A lot of men from my background who just feel very uncomfortable with that. Maybe they'd be more appreciative of it in that situation.
They will, Simon. Yeah, they will. I mean, does anyone understand the English,
How that went with you up in Scotland?
Definitely the Scots were, we're pretty stiff upper lip as well, but probably not quite as much. And I never found a problem. Old, young. And again, you probably don't do it day two. It's just in that initial, it's just a connecting. I think even the English will feel, welcome that. Well, so there's two here, I better watch myself. Two big men. Yeah. Three? Oh, three? Oh dear. Yeah. I'm really outnumbered here. Yeah, you have to be sensitive to. Daniel's all over everybody. He can't keep his hands off you. Yeah, there are cultural considerations. Craig.
Don't behave in Germany like you would in Latin America, and don't behave in Latin America like you would in Germany. You got to know your people.
Yep. And it might not be a kind of full bear hug, but just even an arm around a shoulder or something like that. Okay, let's move on to know. Know the dead person. That might seem a bit strange, but what I mean by that is, if you didn't know the person well before, then ask about him or her, and that will especially happen in your early days in a new congregation. So you want to ask the mourners, tell me something about this person. And often people do want to speak about the last hours, last days, in tremendous detail. And that's part of the normal processing of grief. And you have to let people do it as long as necessary. And you might often be sitting there going, I really don't want to know, what happened at 101, then 102, then 103, and what medications and what the doctors, and go on and on and on. But it's so important for the person to relive these last moments, and they might tell you it again the next time you come, and again, and whatever you do, don't say, well, I know this already, you told me before. It's therapeutic for them. They just like to talk about the last minutes of their loved ones' lives, or last days. So try to remain patient, try to remain engaged. Don't ask in a public setting these main primary mourners about the person's spiritual state unless you're pretty sure the person was a Christian. So, you're in this living room or around a hospital bed and you ask, was he a Christian? And he wasn't. And so, the implication is left hanging painfully there about what you're thinking about that person's ultimate destination. And if they say he died Christless, then for the Christians among them, and even those who are not, that really maximizes the pain. It's important to find out about the person's spiritual condition, but you can find it out in more roundabout ways, more private ways, and from others who know them, and that will guide you in your responses. And again, we're talking here about people you don't know, because either you're too early in the congregation, or, as often happens, you're asked to come and minister to a family's loved one that has never been near you, doesn't go to church, or other different circumstances. Now, remember, it's not your job to declare who went to heaven and who did not. We've got to leave that with the judge of all the earth, who will do right. And it's quite common for a bereaved person to speak of hopes they have, spiritual hopes, heavenly hopes, for somebody that was clearly unconverted. What do you do in that situation? Well, again, this is not the time to try and correct that. Silence is the best policy. The main focus in these circumstances is the spiritual state of those who are left, rather than the spiritual state of the dead. So don't ask this question in that public, potentially embarrassing and painful situation. Don't correct when somebody speaks of false hopes for a clearly unconverted person. And again, I'm talking about these moments just surrounding death. I'm not saying what you do down the road, more in less emotional circumstances. We have the potential to minister to an individual. And then also, well, what do you do if you're asked? Where do you think he is, Pastor? Well, I put down a few suggestions there. You just say, well, that's God's domain. It's not my job to do that. God is the judge of all the earth, and he'll do right. Or we could say, if the person might say, well, he didn't, profess to be a Christian. Again, you can say, well, we don't know what happens to a person's soul in their last hours or even seconds. We don't. However little hope you have of that, that's still a truth. And again, just to try and turn it, let's focus on our own spiritual state. There's nothing we can do about Jim or Jane. Let's focus on ourselves. Let's make sure we are ready ourselves by believing the gospel, the only way of salvation. Daniel. Yeah.
And he was speaking out
Yeah.
in many situations in church, with other people in church, about the certainty that this person was in heaven, was an elder. I mean, how to deal with this situation, because the elder is spreading error.
Right. Well, yeah, that is a bit different, Daniel. I think I would want to try and get the person in private. I'm not going to say anything in public there when I first hear that. But really to pull them aside and ask them, what's your basis for this? And And if they have no basis, then I think you can say, well, this is not wise to be suggesting to everyone else who knows this person did not live a godly life that they're in heaven. Again, just to try and do it privately. Right?
What about the times when everyone is sure that they were unconverted? It's just
Right.
it's there.
Well, again, I think you've got to try and turn it to the people who are left and say, well, what about ourselves? That is the key. There's nothing we can do about this now. The key is not to recreate this situation down the line when we die, unconverted and clearly so. So I've never found it wise, edifying to dwell on the state of an unconverted person in hell. Maybe that's just softness on my part, but I mean, we have to be human as well. And, you know, there's natural affection and loss here that we can minister to. Okay, so obviously a person's a Christian, it changes everything. Everything. Much joy can even be had. Not unmixed. There's sorrow here. But, you know, thinking on the person's last days, last hours, their witness. So try to think of different responses to different kinds of death. For example, a Christian senior. That's usually the easiest situation to deal with. You know, they've led a good life, they've led a long life, and it's been a good life, and now they're in a better place. It's very tempting just to be joyful in these situations. Hey, what's to mourn? But we still mustn't minimize the pain of death, even of a godly Christian who has lived a long, good, and happy life. And that's especially true where the person's been happily married for many years. Even leaving behind a godly widow, there's much fear, usually in a bereaved person, deep loneliness. Remember, Christ groaned and wept, even though he knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He knew Lazarus was a believer. He knew Lazarus was going to come back to life, and yet he still wept and he still groaned. A young unbeliever, well, it doesn't really get any worse than this, does it? So it might be an accident, road traffic accident. I think they're the worst, personally. Or the result of a terminal illness. Again, just such hard situations to deal with. These situations raise lots of questions in people's minds, even believers. God's goodness, God's wisdom, God's justice, purpose of life, judgment, hell. Was it Tim or was it Rosario who talked about this? I can't remember. How the way people live is a large factor in what people believe. So if you're living a sinful life, then it's much easier to believe in relativism. Does anyone remember that, or am I thinking of Rosario? Yeah. And you can find, say, a Christian couple lose a young person, a teenager or younger, and their son, their daughter dies an unbeliever. That can create a liberal out of a conservative. You can have people who are as sound as a pound or as a dollar, going down the road of faith until this happens, and then, do I really believe in judgment? Can I believe in hell? It's easier not to believe in hell than to believe that my son is in hell. So lots and lots of questions here are going to be raised. It's going to maybe take a long time. And you'll be quite stunned, really, at some of the mature, sober, serious Christians, the way that their actual beliefs change through providences like this. And it may be temporary, but it's not safe for even a day to be in that kind of state. Then you've got the unbeliever, thinking here of someone who has lived a longer life than the young person, but it's still agony to think, for believers to think of such a person being in hell. God uses these things. You'll find that when these things happen, it really sharpens your preaching. And it really gives an urgency to your counseling. You'll kind of look back and think, was I living in a kind of fog up till now? So these are very clarifying times. Then you've got a young believer. So a young person's faith, that changes a lot, but it doesn't change everything. Mustn't minimize the pain of death just because the person was a believer. In some ways, it might be even more painful because a Christian parent might think, well, why would God do this to one of his own? Or what about the potential of this Christian young person in terms of service and usefulness? And then there's miscarriage, and I hope to have a lecture on this next semester. That's a unique pain, all of its own. So this is about identifying, knowing, understanding the dead person. Then, secondly, know the chief mourners. Sorry, David.
With miscarriage, stillbirth, practicalities, when do you have a service, when don't you have a service, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I will cover that in more detail. A lot of that is cultural. And it varies so much, and you just want to put yourself at the disposal of a couple. If they say no funeral, again, a lot depends on what stage a miscarriage is at. But there will be some couples just say no, it's almost as if he, she never existed. Or even if they do have a sense of that, the old way was you just didn't have anything. But I think increasingly people are realizing that on the whole, usually it's beneficial to have some kind of service. It might be small, it might be private, and even a burial at times. But it just so much depends on your culture and on the people's wishes. I don't think you want to impose your own view on people in these circumstances. So know the chief mourners. It's usually pretty obvious who are the loved ones most affected by the death. And this is important because obviously you've got to focus your attention on each one of them and recognizing that people grieve differently. Not all men grieve the same, not all women grieve the same, not all young people grieve the same. You might have a wife grieving and yet a daughter is grieving even more. And don't interpret lack of tears as a lack of grief. There can be denial, there can be anger, there can be hysteria, there can be quiet, there can be confusion. So you're just trying to keep your eye open and ear open for the different reactions. And I'm saying chief mourners because also you've got to prioritize your care and your counsel in these situations. And then know the rest of the mourners. So you want to prioritize some, but you don't want to ignore those in outer circles. And so some questions might be, and you'll often find yourself in a home, usually, when you're visiting with family, with friends, with neighbors. What kind of questions do you ask? Well, I think you can ask things like, what are your favorite moments, memories of this person? What did you like best about him or her? And especially if it's a Christian, you're trying to bring out, especially for the benefit of unconverted people, that their virtues, their God-given graces. What do you miss most about this person? What did he, she particularly enjoy? What were his favorite things, places, people, times, books? What has God taught you through this person? Why do you think God brought this person into your life? How has it helped you in your own spiritual journey? And of course, ask if there are any prayer requests. So know the rest of the mourners. It's important that sometimes, you can fall into two traps here. One is not prioritizing the chief mourners, and the other is kind of ignoring everyone outside that family circle. And just try to... funerals are really... They're often make or break times for a pastor, especially in your early days. So especially if you end up in a smallish community, you'll see tons of people you will never have seen before and you won't see again probably. And it's your opportunity even just to shake hands, say hello and introduce yourself. Show that you're not a kind of holier than thou ignoramus who's only interested in his own sheep, as it were. Then know the stages of grief. We touched on this last time, and there are different ways of putting this. The one I've put down here is the Kubler-Ross grief process. That was created or described by a psychiatrist, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, in her 1969 book on death and dying. And she was inspired to do this by her work over many years with the terminally ill. And it's a description of what she witnessed in general in seeing how people die. It's not a complete list of every possible emotion in a death, in a bereavement. It's not something that fits every person in every circumstance. But it can be helpful, especially leading up to a death, if you've got a terminally ill person, to almost, what am I trying to say? It's like a preemptive strike. It's like preparing them for the emotions. You're trying to get somebody ready for the possibilities of what's going to happen after this moment comes and their loved one leaves this earth. And for most people, you just cannot prepare for that. You just don't know until you know it by experience. And yet, to provide some kind of map, some kind of roadmap of expectation, not to be worried if this is what you initially feel or if this goes in this way. So the first stage is denial. This just can't be true. This hasn't happened. He's going to come back. He's going to walk in the door. It's just a refusal to believe what's happened. Sometimes maybe some weird alternative explanation might be found. Things like in road accidents or whatever, there's often a sense of, it just cannot have happened. It's so sudden. It's just, the person is still here. He must be. He's going to come back. So there's a sort of denial. Then there's anger. And again, Christians can have this too, especially if it's a death of an unbelieving child or something like that. Why me? Why my child? This isn't fair. And God is blamed. Others may be blamed, maybe even self-blame. But there's an irritation, there's an agitation, there's a moodiness, there's an edginess, there's a hypersensitivity. It might be something the person's fighting against, but it's still there. Then there's bargaining, where people try to make a deal with God, call a temporary truce, as it were. So this person's been really angry. Then the sense of, well, I better not do this. If God can do that to one child, he could do it to another. Therefore, I'm going to mend my ways and live better and try and get back to maybe how things were. Bargaining often will take place in and up to death as well, where you've got this person who's cancer or something, and their loved one will start saying, oh God, if I go to church, if I give this money, if I do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that, would you heal, would you restore, would you put things back as they were? Then fourthly, depression, where there's an acceptance. There's no longer denial, it's no longer arguing, there's no bargaining your way out of this. It's reality. The loss is admitted, and grieving really begins. Sadness really begins to hit, and that can be healthy. We're meant to mourn. We're meant to weep. We're meant to be sad over sad things. We mustn't disallow that for Christians. But it can obviously be in a very hopeless, unhealthy way, where people withdraw, they become inactive, their sleeping and eating habits are disrupted for a lengthy period of time, and they're just going down, down, down. Fifthly, acceptance, where there's a gradual, usually, climbing out of this sadness, and there's a facing of the loss with more calmness and acceptance and reflection, as I say as well. Can't live in the past, got to regroup, got to rebuild. Life has to go on. What do I do now? One question you might have is, how long do you let this go on for? Well, obviously, I think a lot of that depends on the person, on the situation as well. Obviously, if it's the loss of an older, maybe a husband who's been a believer for many years, you don't want this taking months and months and years. But, if it's the loss of an unbelieving child, I think you can expect this to go on longer, some of these stages at least. You very rarely will get a Christian who'll get to acceptance straight away. And those who do often relapse within the next 2 years and end up going through at least some of these processes. But on the whole, although there's tremendous overprescription of antidepressants following bereavement, at least here in the States, even the most balanced of psychiatrists and doctors will say, if this person's still in depression 2 years down the road, that's sort of taken as a break point, then obviously this person needs some help to get out of this, to think their way out of this paralysis. But as I've said, for many, it's like straight to the doctor, straight on antidepressants, and none of the benefit of these stages is experienced, none of the casting of self upon God for help. And we don't want to encourage that. You don't want to be visiting people in a month or two, I'm still sad and thinking of going for antidepressants. No, this is part of God's plan. You've got to work your way through this with His help and really encourage that perseverance, that endurance, that reliance upon God. This is normal, unless, of course, it's become extremely excessive. And there can be rebuke involved there as well. And I'd also encourage you to look at Bob Kellerman's sort of translation of these stages. I mentioned them in the last lecture as well. But that, I think he goes from 5 stages to 8. Okay? Let's move on to speak. Again, a lot of this is about what not to say. I've put these down in your notes. Call me if I can do anything for you. Why is that not a good thing to say? Well, you can do something for them. And it's up to you to think about it and offer it. Because a lot of people will think, especially for the minister, well, he's very busy and, I can't ask him to do anything. And so they won't. But you want to be in that position where you do things. I know how you feel. Even if you are in a position where you can say that, you have to be careful about saying it. It might come down the road. But again, it's about not trying to direct attention away from the person to yourself. He's in a better place. Well, again, there's a place for saying that, but not in a way that minimizes and is meant to almost rebuke grief in these early stages. You're still young, you can marry again. Well, I don't think I have to explain that. We'll have you over for dinner sometime. No, make the date. If you're going to say something like that, you make the date and you settle it and you commit. How are you? Well, again, what are you expecting to be said there? Would it not be better to say something like, are you finding the grief unbearable? Or do you feel yourself slipping into a depression? You know how they feel, but you're trying to gauge how deep, how long these feelings, how strong they are. You're strong, you'll be okay. Again, grief can overtake the strongest of Christians, and some of the weakest, you think, can be incredibly upheld and strengthened through it. God never gives you more than you can handle. Well, we all know he does, because he can handle it with us. This is a blessing in disguise. Well, it's very well disguised, isn't it? The person might retort, at least inwardly. God uses such times to sanctify us and make us more like Jesus. He does, and that's a truth, and that's something to say down the road. But again, not at the stage of just weeping with those who weep. God is the potter, we are the clay. That's true too. Sovereignty is just so vital here. But again, this kind of statement is much more, it's almost depicting God as, in that person's mind, remember the circumstance they're in, as cruel, as heartless, as unfeeling. Potter, clay. There's no kind of human connection here. Sorry, I think I've gone wrong. Speak with the compass. Okay, I turned over the wrong page there. Let me go to speak words of comfort.
So just on these last things, not to say, is it more, from what I was gathering, it's more to just let them go through the process of grief without necessarily, just like allowing them to go through it, and you're there as support and comfort, and then there'll be a time
Later,
to say
yeah.
that a little bit
Usually,
later on.
yeah. I mean, most people are just totally numb. Unless it's the situation of an older believer, people are much more open and receptive and reasonable. So, speak words of comfort. Things like, I am so sorry. Just say, I know everyone says it, but say it. You are. Sympathy. You must feel so, and fill in the gap. You must feel so lonely. You must feel so broken. You must feel so fearful. Reassurance. I'll be there for you. We'll help you through this. It's okay for men to cry. So you're pointing them to the Father of mercies, the sympathy of Christ, the comfort of the Holy Spirit. And remember to remind them, Jesus not only mourned death, he suffered it himself. So speak words of comfort. Speak words of appreciation. Tell them how you are blessed by the deceased, what you learn from them, how you remember them. Share your memories, especially recent interactions, if they were of a spiritually encouraging nature. If you've got close to that person over the days, months, years, they will have had conversations with you that they will not have had with their loved one. And it's a time for sharing these things. And you can speak words of appreciation even if the person's not been converted. We're not talking about putting them to heaven, but even just on a natural human level, if there are ways in which this person blessed you or helped you or assisted you, meant something to you, again, it's just good to share that with the family. Speak words of instruction. Again, we're getting down the road here. So you want to start reminding them of biblical truths. You're not going to preach a sermon day 1, day 2. You have your funeral, and I think there is where you begin to really begin to put truth underneath this family, this person, in public, gatherings, and also one-on-one. And so you begin to talk. God doesn't make mistakes. God does use such times to sanctify us and make us more like Jesus. God is the potter and we are the clay, and I think that can be used as a rebuke at times, because if the person is just fighting, rebelling, resisting against this providence, they do need to be reminded of this biblical truth. Not on day one, as I say, but down the road. He will never leave us nor forsake us. That's just incredibly precious, that, to people who feel utterly left and utterly forsaken and utterly lonely. Psalm 23, the Lord is our shepherd through the shadows of Death Valley. Give hope, again, that this pain shall pass. Weeping may endure for a night, at morn joy arises. Psalm 30. Now, you might notice, as we've talked about, somebody says something wrong that's an error, or somebody's reacting wrongly. Again, you need a wee bit of wisdom here to know, is this the time? Is this the place? If not, you want to make a note of it, file it, as it were. And so when emotions subside, some days, weeks later, you might want to say, now, do you remember? I know it was the heat of the moment and emotions were really raw. Remember you said this? You really believe that? And I think probably in most cases as a Christian, they'll say, oh, well, no, I shouldn't have said that. I don't believe that at all. But it might be an opportunity for, if it's an unbeliever, to really start challenging some of the faulty principles and presuppositions. Speak words about heaven. So important that we help mourners think most about the believer's soul, perfectly beautified in heaven, than his body rotting in the coffin or in the ground. That is one of the great jobs of the Christian pastor. You'll find it these early days, the focus is very much on that body. And that's what people knew the person by. And that might be in the funeral home, it might be in the church, it might be afterwards as the person gets a bit fixated on that grave and is visiting excessively. You want to really start getting people's thoughts heavenwards. Look, this is important. This body is still united to Christ. This body will one day be resurrected, but the person's not here. He's somewhere else, and that's where we're to direct our thoughts. They're perfect there. They're at home with Christ. They're at rest. There's no sin to mortify. There's no self to crucify. There's no pain to face. There's no enemy to fear. Everything for them is far better. Think also about the satisfaction Jesus gets by the death of his saints, what he gains through every death. He's pleased and he's satisfied with their presence near him, more so than when they were on this earth. So they gain, Jesus gains, we gain too, by getting a more heavenly perspective and by being more watchful. Speak words of warning. There will be unconverted people there. And I think it goes back to maybe what Brian Croft said. If you can't, as it were, preach the gospel, pray the gospel to them. Develop a skill. Without turning your prayer into a sermon entirely, then make sure for the unconverted there, they hear about the realities of hell and judgment and the necessity to be ready for that. In my own tradition in Scotland, we would usually have a funeral service in the home, if it was big enough, or in the church, if the home was not big enough to hold everybody. That was just a very Highland tradition. And it was actually just a family worship. There wasn't really a sermon there, very rarely. It was just psalm, prayer, reading, psalm, prayer. It was all over in about 30 minutes. It's very brief. But then we would go to the graveside, and that's where usually a warning message was given to everyone who was gathered, because you'd have more unconverted people there than ever you would have in a church on a Sunday, especially in a community, a village community. And so what was very expected of the minister in these days and places was you preached in hell, you preached in judgment. You said, when you end up there, where will you be, really? And that's a cultural thing. That's not the norm for everywhere. But somewhere in this process, it's very important, whether in your sermon in the church or whatever, that you address the unconverted, those who are heading to hell without Christ. Speak words of challenge. It might be necessary when grief is excessive or even hysterical. That you need to rebuke Christians and call them to demonstrate how Christian grief is different to the world's. Again, this needs sensitivity and wisdom. And again, it's maybe more so in some cultures than in others. When I was in Eastern Europe for a year in the late 80s, I went to a few gypsy funerals, and it was just horrendous. I've never seen anything like it. They were literally pulling clumps out of their hair, ripping their clothes off. And these were, believing gypsies, lovely believing gypsies, but their culture was this very demonstrative grief. And I didn't do it myself, but the older pastor I was with worked really hard at trying to say, you've got to be different. You can't just do as all the other gypsies do. You've got to show that you're different and your hope is different. So speak words of challenge, speak words of forgiveness. There's often a lot of guilt around deaths of loved ones. Maybe a person feels guilty that they didn't spend more time with the person. Or maybe they died and there was some unresolved conflict. Now, some of that guilt might be false, and you need to help people let it go. But there may be real, genuine guilt that needs to be confessed and gospel forgiveness offered and received. Speak words of submission. A person will often be angry with doctors, even Christians. Why didn't they do more? In terminal illnesses, it's almost impossible to get from diagnosis to death without some medical malpractice of some kind, some mistake, some loss of tests or something. It's just incredible how it can still happen. And often people will fixate on that. Well, if that hadn't happened, or this had gone better with this doctor, not that doctor. And you've got to just really help people come to a place of submission. The Lord's will has been done. They might be angry with the dead person. Why could he leave me like this? Why didn't he go earlier to the doctors? Or they're angry with God. Again, submission to God's sovereignty is required. Speak words of calm. I put down there in your notes the top fears of widows. Fear of the future, fear of being isolated, fear of changing relational dynamics. In other words, when the husband goes, will the children still come and see me? What about brothers, sisters, and so on? Fear of living alone, fear of running out of money, fear of getting sick and having no one to help. So a lot of people need calming words of reassurance. Speak words of Scripture throughout, of course, these other points too, but I've put down some specially helpful passages there. Let me just run through the rest. In terms of doing, put them in touch with others who have suffered similar losses. Number 2, encourage the person eventually to get back to work, to get back into Christian service especially. And that can be a wonderful antidote because, often if it's a terminal illness, the person's been very tied up for years maybe, at least months, and now there's nothing. There's nothing. That daily routine is gone, so time to get them doing gently in Christian service. Ensure deacons inquire about financial needs, funeral expenses, and so on. That should just be a standard. It really doesn't matter what family. Follow up long term. So there are much longer term consequences to bereavement. Find out what a typical day looks like for them. Getting into a good routine with the 3 R's. What are the 3 R's? Must be. Yeah, not in this case. It must be things like rest, recreation, and what must the other one be? Well, hopefully it'll come back. Yeah, just amazing stats there. In the first year of bereavement, widows and widowers have a death rate 10 times as great as that of a similar segment of the population which has not been bereaved. And it's associated, the stress of it, it's body breaking. It's not just heartbreaking, it's body breaking. And then dealing with people whose grief is beyond the normal, some questions to ask there. I'll let you read them. I don't need to go over them. Give the person opportunity to serve other mourners, other volunteering activities that help others. I think we've covered that. Person may need to develop a new identity. So oftentimes a wife especially, they were kind of known as so-and-so's wife. Now then so-and-so is gone. Who are they? Who am I? And encourage them to develop the other relationships. So a different role. Sometimes taking on the jobs that a loved one used to do for you. People will often say it feels like being a child again. Needing help, asking for help, building confidence. Remember the children. Find a calm person to really care for these young ones. Reassure them of God's love and care. And all this applies to lesser losses too, to a lesser degree. Loss of health, loss of youth, loss of independence, loss of usefulness, loss of meaning. So there are many losses people experience in life that a lot of this can apply to as well. And I've put there in you, at the back of your notes, different resources for you, some wonderful books on this whole area. Again, it's a good subject to read one book on every year. You'll always pick up something. And then some resolutions from The Undistracted Widow, an older book, applying some of the verses in Philippians to bereavement. Any thoughts, Ryan?
Do you have some words about what to pray, especially with that first day or that first time you see them?
Okay. Yep, I think just to try and articulate the grief, I think is the main thing. To really work on, Lord, you know the pain of this situation, the sorrow, the fear, the anger, even just to be really honest. It's not easy for us to, especially if it's, say, the tragic death of a young person. But we find it hard to believe in your sovereignty in these times and things like that. I think it'll come very naturally. I think if you enter into the sympathy side of things, the words will come. Again, I don't think it's a time for long prayers anyway, and lots of words spoken quickly. You want to just slow down, speak a little, let pauses in prayer happen. You just want to come across as, I'm finding this as hard as everyone else here. I'm not an expert at this. I'm not a pro. And don't be afraid to be like that. I don't think people are looking for you to be an expert in these circumstances. Danielle.
One of the difficulties for us to minister to the bereaved in Brazil is that usually the burial and the funeral will happen within 24 hours.
Aye, really, yeah.
So everything moves like.
Right, yeah. Yeah, that's different. Yeah, that does change some things. And do people move on very quickly afterwards, or? Yeah.
We still suffer a lot.
Okay.
The human is the same.
Yeah.
But just the practice is different.
Right.
Right?
It's so different. I mean, here it can be, you can be over a week. You can be 10 days.
24 hours.
Yeah.
Easily that in the UK.
The UK as well, really. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my grandmother's last year was held over a little bit, so I had to get back.
Aye, that's right.
It was 2.5 weeks.
Yeah.
But it would have been 10 days easily.
10, yeah. I think where I was, it was about 3 days. That was more of a smaller community.
Northern Ireland, I think, was quick, but
Yeah.
compared to the rest of
So adjust accordingly.
What would you take the other approach that some people take to the funeral? We're just here to celebrate the life, so we'll have lots of laughter, lots of humour, lots of upbeat songs. This is just, I'm not talking about the world, I'm talking about
I know.
Christians. What would
Yeah.
you take on that?
I haven't faced that, to be honest. I think if I did, I would ask them if they wanted to get someone else to do it. Because you just couldn't act that out, and you wouldn't want to either. I mean, you'd also try and explain this is not healthy. Most people find, although initially it takes the edge off things, that in the long term this does not help people grieve because it's not real. And although it's painful to accept reality, it's in the long run going to help people come out of it better. You know, you want to try and explain, but at the end of the day, if having explained and asked if they would accommodate, then eventually you have to say, well, I want you to have what you want, even though I don't agree with it, so feel free to ask somebody else. I've done that with weddings too, because some weddings can get outlandish in the requests to ministers. You're not a paid entertainer, you know. You're a minister of the Word of God. If they want someone other than a minister of the Word of God, you can find that. Ryan?
Suicides.
Yeah. I had one. I've only had one. Why don't I try and answer that, Ryan, in a more lengthy, organised way? Because it's a good question, and it is different. Yeah, is that okay? I'll take a note of it. Again, a lot depends on the circumstances, but
Bancroft is a short section of his book,
okay,
Christ-centered funerals.
right. I've got a few resources on it, but I think it'd be good for me maybe to put them together and organise it. I've never done that before. I had a guy, a Christian member whose prayers I enjoyed more than anybody else's prayers in the church. He was a rough diamond, was converted late in life, and then his children accused him of abusing them. He ended up in prison in Inverness, which of course for a sex offender is just horrific to be in prison. That was before the trial. He got out on bail, and within 2 days he'd hung himself, denying the allegations. Yep. Well, shall we finish up? Paul, do you want to pray?